Brilliant. Good evening, everyone. My name is Rhys Davis. I'm a barrister at Temple Garden Chambers. We're meeting now to have a conversation about the Interpol General Assembly 2025. We have a panel of extremely knowledgeable experts this evening who are, we're going to have something, I suppose, a fireside chat just to talk about where Interpol is at the moment, what's happening at the General Assembly, what the General Assembly is, the election of the new president of Interpol and what that means for the direction of travel for the organisation and what we can expect to see in the future. Let me begin by firstly thanking our panel and also introducing them. The first person that I shall turn to introduce is Ben Keith, a fellow barrister, 5 St Andrews Hill. Ben is the co-founder of Red Notice Monitor. I have in front of me Ben's profile on his website, and I'm, as always, in awe of the remarkable quotes from Chambers and Partners and the Legal 500. And my gag, which Ben is smiling at, which I always make in these circumstances, these quotes are so good because I wrote half of them. And so I mean every word of it. He is one of the most talented, knowledgeable and dedicated, experienced extradition law and human rights barristers around. So Ben, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I've got also with me, I've got Ted Bromans, friend of the show. Ted, Ted, late of the Heritage Foundation.
That is correct. Late of,
but perhaps you were the Margaret Thatcher Fellow, weren't you? Is that right?
I was in the Margaret Thatcher Center for many years. 16.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that perhaps one of the most seasoned Interpol watchers around, a writer for Forbes, Newsweek, many other publications, casting often a critical eye over Interpol.
Very often a critical eye, in fact.
Yeah, well, welcome also. And we have from wet and rainy Miami, we have Michelle Esland. Michelle, also welcome to you. The founder of Esland Law, and I think it's fair to say the go-to lawyer for Interpol and Red Notice matters in the Florida area and indeed, I suppose, the East Coast. And so, thank you, Michelle, for joining us. I feel that we've got a kind of Europe versus US theme here this evening. It's a bit like the Ryder Cup. Who shall win? I don't know. Michelle, can I turn to you first and ask you to set the scene? We've got, I think, is it this week coming? Is it the beginning of the General Assembly? What is the General Assembly, and why should we care, Michelle?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. Very nice to be here. I'm not sure I agree with the versus characterization.
No, we're on the same thing.
Right? Yeah. Give me just a second. I'm sorry, because I was enthralled by your intro, and so I closed my notes down.
Well, this is all part of the gamesmanship. You see, you say that it's not antagonistic, but in fact, I try to throw you off. So.
Right. Well done. Well done. So I'll speak, and you just interrupt whenever there's a question, or if I'm talking too long, we want to get to another topic. I thought to address 3 primary issues today, which is what is the General Assembly and what happens within the yearly meetings of the General Assembly, and then what can we expect specifically this year during the General Assembly, which is coming up in Morocco later this month. So the General Assembly is the supreme governing body of Interpol, and it comprises representatives from every member country. We're now at 196. So the General Assembly's roles and duties is established in Article 6 of Interpol's Constitution, and it's responsible for deciding Interpol's goals, the means by which it's going to achieve those goals, and approving the activities and the financial plan for the upcoming year. Obviously, it's important to think about the General Assembly in the context of its relationship with other parts of Interpol. So, clearly the General Assembly's relationship with the General Secretariat and the Secretary General is one of a fairly constant reliance, because the members of the General Assembly are delegates who are selected from their member countries to serve on the GA, General Assembly, and that requires intermittent work and obligations. But the delegates have their own full-time occupations in their respective countries back home. So the employees of the General Secretariat and the Secretary General are full-time employees of Interpol, and they are the people who are implementing and overseeing the matters that the GA decides on a yearly basis. The General Assembly has the final say in what the requirements are for the organization and its member countries. The Executive Committee, which the Interpol president heads, supervises the execution of the decisions that the GA makes. The Executive Committee, I'm not going to get into too much detail about that, but it's a governing body that provides guidance and directions in between sessions of the GA. And at times it has taken the initiative to form and introduce policies before they're formally presented or voted on by the General Assembly. And an example of that might be the refugee policy that was previously implemented and has been observed to date. So what happens during the yearly meetings? The Executive Committee will supervise the execution of the decisions of the General Assembly. Before the General Assembly, it decides the agenda for the session, and it will submit to the General Assembly any program of work or any project that it considers to be useful, and it supervises the administration and the work of the Secretary General. That's the Executive Committee. Next, I'll go into what happens at a General Assembly meeting, the annual meeting. Typically, what we might expect in a typical meeting. Usually it's going to last for about 4 days. It follows an agenda on both recurring and novel items that are going to be voted on by Interpol's member countries. A member country that wants to host the meeting can offer to do so, and that's the reason we've seen them hosted in so many different places. The GA delegates vote to determine where the meeting will take place. Some of the more recent meetings have been in the UK, in Austria, India, Turkey, Chile, UAE, China, and Rwanda. And as I said, this year will be in Morocco. We typically see Interpol's annual report presented and publicized at the annual meeting of the General Assembly. I can't think of an example of when that has not happened. The report will usually include a summary of the progress of ongoing projects, and it'll give a broad accounting of income and expenditures. It'll give a statement of short and long-term goals, and it will also give proposals to modify Interpol's functioning or governing legal texts. So the way the decisions are made is by the representatives of each member country voting. And Article 7 of Interpol's constitution provides that the delegates need to be officials of certain departments that deal with police affairs or whose normal duties are connected with the activities of Interpol, or specialists of the subject on the agenda. So usually we see that these people are chiefs of police and senior ministry officials. The interesting thing is that every member country is permitted one vote, and that sounds fair on the surface, but it becomes more interesting, at least to me, when you consider that they get one vote regardless of their size, regardless of their monetary contribution to Interpol, regardless of their number of delegates that they send to the General Assembly, and regardless of the country's reputation for law enforcement, for human rights observation. Everybody's on equal footing. They can have their rights to vote suspended. That rarely happens. In general, every country has the same voting capacity.
So the Federation of Micronesia is as mighty as China for the purposes of the elections. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's something that Ted and I have talked about before, that, it's, as I said, it's an interesting phenomenon, and it certainly has an effect, a positive and a negative effect. Obviously smaller countries, could otherwise be incapacitated practically if they had a vote that was proportional to their size.
Yeah.
But, the negative is, if you've got countries that are bigger and more democratically accountable, one might hope that they had a bigger sway, and they don't. So before the vote on a resolution, the drafts of the resolution for the General Assembly are translated into Interpol's 4 working languages, which are Arabic, English, French, and Spanish, and distributed to the delegates. So in theory, we have a chance to consider those items before they come up for a vote. And what we would expect typically, without a lot of variance from year to year, would be applications from non-member countries that want to join, elections of the executive committee, and a determination of what actions the organization is going to take going forward, setting goals and activities, including financial plans. So the topics can change rapidly in the agenda when we talk about specific year-to-year changes. For example, in 2022, there were different panels that were discussing issues like financial crime and anti-corruption, cybercrime, Interpol's iFamilia database, which uses the family DNA to match, identify missing persons. And that changed quite dramatically just 2 years later, because by 2024, artificial intelligence that year included ongoing technological advances like biometric frontline capabilities. I think I might have lost my connection. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah, you
Okay.
froze for about a
And
second.
they had a focus that year on field officers using mobile devices to check biometrics of people in transit at various border sites, and an emphasis on AI and the future of policing. So you do see a big difference in some of the more specific items on the agenda. I'm going to skip ahead to talk about the 2025 agenda, and then if we want to get
Yeah.
into any more detail, we can. So this year, what we're expecting is a range of issues, and Interpol has published this on its website, and it tells us that what they're expecting is to discuss identifying, disrupting transnational organized crime, which we all know is a recurring issue, and it's becoming more and more common as the world becomes more globally available, right, to both law enforcement and I was going to say alleged, but there is crime and to criminals, right? So
yes, the criminal
they're also-
defense law
right.
speaks there. It's always alleged, isn't it?
Yeah, it's in the blood, no? They're also focusing on dismantling transnational scam centers, the expansion of Interpol's global policing capacities, which is a pretty consistent item to see. Women in policing, Silver Notice pilot project results, because remember that the Silver Notice started this year. The first ones were issued, I want to say in January. So that'll be interesting to see what the results of that project have been. And then the promotion of ratifying the UN Convention Against Cybercrime. And then finally, which I think others are going to discuss in some more detail, will be the vote on the members of the executive committee, including the president, as their respective mandates have come to an end. So that's what we're expecting in the upcoming General Assembly for this year.
Michelle, that's brilliant. That's incredibly detailed. One of the things that occurs to me as you speak about all this, you're talking about the voting system, you're talking about the items that are likely to be on the agenda. Is the General Assembly a transparent event that we as observers are able to kind of get under the skin of and really kind of see the conversations that are taking place? And what about the voting system, for example? Is that something which you would describe as transparent?
I would not describe it as transparent. There's an issue that's, or excuse me, there's an announcement that's given, for example, to media, right? Media is allowed to come and watch the General Assembly, some portions of it.
Yeah.
But certainly not all of it, not the voting, the discussions that they have on the various issues. I would not describe it as being transparent. And I know that some of us might hear scuttlebutt about what happens during those panels and those meetings. And transparent? No, I don't think I.
No, I honest with you, that was something of a leading question. Michelle, but that's extremely detailed. Thank you for that. I'm going to pause you for a moment and bring you back in just a few minutes' time. But I'm going to turn to Ben in just a moment and ask him to talk to us about the election and the candidates, in particular the Turkish candidate for presidency. But before I do that, Ted, I want to bring you in very briefly. I know that you well, I wouldn't say you have a bugbear, but you certainly you're a very keen observer of the kind of internal dynamics, country to country, and the power dynamics that exist within Interpol. It's not a transparent process that's unfolding at the moment. There is the distorting effect of one member, one vote, is something which you've spoken and written about very, very often and in a great deal of detail. Do you think that that's a problem that's beginning to go away, or is it something that's still an issue for the organisation?
I think the problems, and Michelle is entirely right to point out that There is an element of justice in having one nation, one vote, just as there is an element of justice in having one nation, one vote in the UN General Assembly. The difference is that Interpol lacks structurally something like the UN Security Council. Now, Interpol, Michelle has mentioned the Interpol Executive Committee, which you might analogize a little bit to the UN Security Council, but there is no veto holding in the Interpol Executive Committee, and thus it really lacks that kind of stopping power, that controlling power that the UN Security Council has. I think the problems that are inherent in one nation, one vote are, if anything, probably getting worse. And the reason I say this is because Interpol over the last 20 years has admitted a very large number of relatively less well-off states that have relatively limited law enforcement capabilities. And as a result, they tend to be rather amenable to nations like China, which has thrown its weight around in General Assembly and Interpol as a whole to achieve a degree of influence that, to an extent, is warranted by China's size and wealth and importance, but which is far more significant than is merited by any of those things. You can see also nations like the UAE. We now have a departing president of Interpol from the UAE. The UAE is now chairing Interpol's ongoing committee on its own organization. It's hard to see that UAE would have achieved this position in Interpol were it not for the influence of its financial contributions to Interpol and the extraordinary power that this gives this influence that it gives UAE over many of Interpol's smaller member states.
Yeah, well, speaking of the UAE, I'm going to turn to Ben. Ben, we're coming to the sunset of the Major General Al Raisi years in Interpol. He was elected, I can't believe it's 4 years ago now, isn't it? Since he was elected. You and I have written and spoken about his role in the organization. There was a lot of controversy when Major General Al Raisi was elected. He's been subject to various accusations of malfeasance, which we won't repeat here today, but anyone who's interested, of course, will probably know already, but you can look it up online. We're now seeing the end of his tenure. Presumably, Ben, what we're now seeing is a cuddly Norwegian and an impartial Swede and a gentle Swiss in the running for the next president's chair. Is that right?
Exactly. That's exactly what's happening. What I suppose is worth saying that when we were looking at the election in 2021 of Mohammed Al Raisi, it was pretty much a secret. It was only discovered who was running for the presidency in 2021 because Mohammed Al Raisi printed a load of leaflets, which then got distributed, and a few of them found their way to the media, who found out that he was then standing for the presidency. And then we wrote a report with Sir David Calvert-Smith about the problems of the UAE holding the presidency of Interpol, particularly to reputation wash in terms of international law. However, this time we've actually got a public announcement, so we actually know who the candidates are going to be for the 4-year presidency, and there are four candidates. The first is Mr. Weldiez, who's the Commissioner General, the Chief of the Ethiopian Federal Police. Then we have Mr. Philippe, who's the Controller General of the European and International Affairs Advisor to the Director General of the French National Police. And then we have Miss Nanda, who's a Major General and the Deputy Inspector General of the Namibian Police Force, responsible for administration. And then we have Mr. Sabanka, who's the first degree Chief Superintendent, Head of Interpol Europe Department, and Head of Interpol National Central Bureau of Turkey. So we know who the four candidates are: Ethiopia, France, Namibia, and Turkey. Several of those candidates already hold positions on the executive committee.
And those are all
The one that
countries
really,
with rule of law jurisdictions and unblemished records when
well,
it comes
apart,
to
of
Interpol.
course, the main problem, of course, being Turkey. And we've written about this a lot, and we've all spoken about this a lot, is that um, whilst Russia and China get the headlines in terms of abuse, I mean, our collective experience, I think, is that Turkey are one of the worst and most persistent abusers of Interpol. And just for context, for those listening, after the attempted coup in 2016 by who was alleged to be Fethullah Gulen, there was a massive crackdown on civil society by President Erdogan. And when I say massive crackdown, thousands and thousands of civil society and civil servants were put in prison, lost their jobs, from judges to lawyers to teachers to university academics to social workers, anybody who's related to them who might possibly have either Kurdish or Gulenist ties. And at around that time, Turkey then looked to try and persecute as many potential Gulenists or individuals who might have been sympathetic or to Gulenist or even just anti the government, using Interpol's databases. And they uploaded, I think, some 3,500 red notices and red diffusions at one go, attempting to extradite and persecute people who are outside Turkey. That was eventually largely stopped by Interpol. And we don't know. I don't know whether anybody knows whether they were put on special measures or not. I hope they were, but the that abuse has continued. So there's that one big upload, but Turkey has continued to pursue individuals and commit transnational repression against individuals. I mean, Mr. Gulen himself, in the first Trump administration, there was attempts to have him extradited effectively by paying lots of money to members of who were close to the then Trump administration in order to have him extradited or surrendered. We've had threats to Finland and Sweden that if they don't hand over members of the Gulenists who have asylum there and run human rights charities there, particularly in Stockholm, that Turkey would consider blocking their membership of NATO. And most recently, in a very recent, been a recent article showing that the Turkish National Central Bureau has in fact been issuing advice to police officers to remove mention of any political crimes from red notices so that they will go through and will not be flagged by Interpol. And so 9 years after the attempted coup, we're still seeing brazen attempts by the Erdogan regime to use transnational repression against individuals, some of whom directly oppose, and some of whom who are just anti the repression and crackdown on what is normal civil society. I mean, to give you an example, there was a lady in the UK who came to me, and she had posted. I think she was a teacher, and she had posted some anti-Erdogan material on her Facebook saying, you know, this is terrible. The president was persecuting people. And she got threats from the Erdogan government. She got a letter written to her from the National Central Bureau of Turkey via the UK National Central Authority to say you have committed a crime against the president. It's absolutely extraordinary for somebody who's not really a political activist who just posted some material on Facebook for that to come through the UK. And so we've seen that Turkey have hosted the General Assembly, remind me, when was it? It was a couple of years ago now, in Istanbul, similar to the way the UAE has done. They have been lobbying slowly and surely to try and get the presidency. And so to replace the UAE with Turkey would be out of the frying pan into the fire, essentially. It would be no improvement.
Why does it matter? People will say, well, look, actually, the president doesn't hold the reins of power. It's really the Secretary General. I think we will be talking about that in a bit. Why will it matter if Turkey does have the presidency?
I think there are two things. Firstly, Mohammed al-Raisi is trying to politicize the role of president. So he has used it for his own PR and UAE PR purposes. So whilst the president himself or herself doesn't actually hold very much power, they are simply the chairman of the board, effectively, chairman of the executive committee. he has made sure every opportunity to have a photo opportunity, glad handing every despot coming who wants to donate money to Interpol, and having literally having the red carpet rolled out for him by autocratic regimes. And so he's been very much the face of Interpol in when he can be so. And he's used that, and the UAE have used that to show that they are cooperating with international law and working within the international law system. And the concern is that Turkey will do the same, that Turkey will use the presidency to effectively reputation wash their repression and crack down on civil society by saying, well, don't worry about that because we hold the presidency of Interpol, and therefore you've got nothing to worry about in terms of us misusing the Interpol system. And the optic, I mean, we've also had a Chinese president, Meng Hongwei, who we don't talk about very much because it's such an extraordinary story, but he disappeared. Slash was kidnapped by the Chinese authorities and was held incognito for, I think, 3 or 4 weeks before reappearing. So, I mean, the presidency is not it has a pretty poor track record of individuals and countries that comply with human rights, and to electing a Turkish president would, I suppose, continue in that theme, but it would be incredibly disappointing from a human rights perspective.
But thanks for that. I'm going to turn, Ted, to you now and ask you to talk about some of these structural issues, but also what else we can expect to see from the General Assembly.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit of color to both some comments Michelle has made and remarks Ben has made. Reese, you asked Michelle if the Interpol General Assembly is an open and transparent organization. I mean, obviously a setup question, as you said, but I will just add absolutely, because I attended as press the last Interpol General Assembly in Glasgow, Scotland, in person. And the experience, although it was interesting and educational, informative, and I'm glad I went, and I will be attending this upcoming meeting in Marrakesh, Morocco, where, by the way, I will be blogging for the Red Notice Monitor on what goes on there on a day-by-day basis. It is absolutely not transparent. As a member of the press, even in Glasgow, you are held in a very small pen inside the convention area. You are only allowed to attend the most ceremonial parts, the opening and closing of the General Assembly. You see none of the debate, you see none of the votes. You have only supervised and highly structured opportunities to meet with anyone who is connected with Interpol, either with the Interpol organization or on a national delegate level. You do not have free access as you might in the UN or in a congressional building in the United States to walk around and talk with people freely. It is a highly controlled environment.
Why is that? Why is it so highly controlled?
Well, the excuse, and there is probably some justification for this, to be fair, the excuse with Interpol is always that we're a law enforcement organization, we have secrets to keep. And undoubtedly, Interpol does have some secrets that should not be exposed to the general public. That's probably fair. But I'm afraid I believe that what it really comes down to is that Interpol is an organization run by cops for cops, and its default mode is non-transparency and non-disclosure. And I think they are particularly unhappy with the possibility of insiders sitting in on General Assembly debates and votes, because then you would see who is voting for what. And that information is never released after the General Assembly is concluded. You get a raw vote total, but you don't get any breakdown of who voted for what. I think Interpol is really chary about letting that come out. And I just, before we pass on to the other things that are coming up at this meeting, I want to point out something that Ben has said that is very important. The Turkish candidate is the head of the Turkish National Central Bureau, the NCB. We shouldn't just gloss over what that means. Every Interpol member state has an NCB, a National Central Bureau. The US has one, the UK has one, everyone else does. They are the focal point for contact between the national police authorities in a given nation and Interpol. Everything goes through that NCB. So we have the extraordinary situation where Mr. Sabanka, the Turkish candidate to become the president of Interpol, is personally responsible for all of the abuse and the attempted abuse that has flown from Turkey to Interpol and out into the Interpol system, because all of it has passed directly over his desk. He is personally responsible for it. And so I agree entirely with the reasons that Ben gave about why electing a Turkish police official to head Interpol would be a bad idea. But I'll give you one more reason I think it matters. This is an opportunity to take the temperature of Interpol's membership, because every member state of Interpol has an opportunity to vote for the presidency of Interpol. If the member nations of Interpol take Interpol's rules seriously and upholding those rules seriously, I do not see how in good conscience they could vote for someone who is personally responsible for this flood of Turkish abuse and attempted abuse. If they vote for him, especially in a majority, we know that most of the member states of Interpol don't care about these issues. If they reject him, then we know that many of the member states of Interpol actually do care and take the organization and its rules seriously. So this is a temperature-taking moment for Interpol. If they get it right, great. If they get it wrong, that's bad in lots of other areas.
Are you prepared to put a bet as to whether or not your perspective is sad? I mean, do you think they are going to vote for a lunatic to take over the asylum?
I would never call him a lunatic. I'm sure he's much more organized than that. Perhaps that's too bad. If I had to make a bet right now, I think Mr. Sabanka, the Turkish candidate, is probably the favorite, but by no means guaranteed. These things sometimes have very surprising outcomes. So I'm not giving up hope just yet, but Ben has made a fairly compelling argument about the kind of effort that Turkey has put into appearing to have a good face within Interpol. And the example of the UAE suggests that that kind of effort pays off. China has been making the same kind of efforts. Ben mentioned the effective kidnapping of Meng Hongwei, the former Interpol president, and yet China is on the agenda again this year as a candidate to be the vice president for Asia of Interpol. So you can kidnap the president of Interpol from your own country, and yet within a few years, you can be in a position to potentially hold the vice presidency. So we know this kind of effort matters and it works. So it might work for Turkey.
Well, we're going to see the presidential election take place. What else are we going to be seeing that gives you cause for concern that takes place at this General Assembly?
So we're almost certain that the General Assembly is going to be voting on a new general agreement on the privileges and immunities of Interpol. This is something that's been on the General Assembly's agenda off and on since 2022. In Glasgow last year at the General Assembly, they approved the nomination of a drafting committee for this agreement. Presuming it comes up for a vote, which it probably will, presuming the General Assembly passes it, which it probably will, this agreement on immunities will go to member countries for them to adopt via their own national processes. We don't know a lot about the content of this proposed general agreement on immunities. It is normal for a country that hosts a General Assembly meeting to adopt an immunity agreement before that meeting as a condition of hosting it. The United Kingdom did that before the Glasgow meeting of 2024. But I would strongly suspect that this general agreement would be a lot broader, as indicated by the name. It might be along the lines of the US's International Organization Immunities Act, which makes it all but impossible, with very limited exceptions, to successfully sue Interpol or any other international organization in the United States. It's hard not to see this proposed general agreement as a reflection of the legal risks that Interpol faces. And these risks are regularly pointed out in various Interpol documents. For example, the most recent financial report for 2023 notes that Interpol, quote, is dependent on its member countries for the input of notices and data to its databases. The organization is exposed to risks in the quality of data and implementation of new data handling standards. Similarly, if you go to the Commission for the Control of Interpol's Files, the CCF, the Commission, is a kind of appellate body. If you go to their activity report for 2021, they state that, quote, the possible gaps between restrictions imposed by some NCBs and rules in place in some regions may create an increased risk for litigations.
That sounds like a euphemism.
Well, in other words, what they mean is that the CCF asks questions about notices of NCBs around the world. The NCBs don't answer, and that places Interpol in the position of falling foul of European legal standards.
Yeah.
I'll yield to the barristers and the attorneys on the panel, but I'm pretty sure that's precisely what it means. Interpol has already taken a lot of actions to reduce legal risks. In fact, virtually every significant Interpol reform over about the last 10 years has been motivated in significant part by Interpol's fear of being successfully sued, as it was in 2015 in the so-called Red Notices case, where Interpol paid out about 1.5 million euros to a number of defendants from Indonesia, a number of litigants from Indonesia, pardon me. If you think of things like the creation of the Notices and Diffusions Task Force, the NDTF, that now scans incoming red notice requests. If you look at the reconfiguration of the Commission for the Control of Interpol's Files and many other measures, all of these have been driven in significant part by concern about Interpol's legal vulnerability. So I see this new general agreement as Interpol's most serious effort yet to slam the door on any possible future litigation that would almost certainly be based on Interpol's handling of red notices or diffusions that turned out to be abusive. And the problem with this is that since most of the meaningful Interpol reforms over the last decade have been, according to Interpol's own words, been motivated significantly by concerns about being sued, the possibility of shutting down the lawsuit avenue vis-a-vis Interpol can only reduce Interpol's interest in enacting the kind of future reforms that I certainly think continue to be absolutely necessary if Interpol is going to live up to its own proclaimed standards.
What's top of your wish list for reform?
There are three things that I would really like to see done, and bear in mind, this is only at the Interpol level. Nations within their NCBs could do other things. But at the top, I want to recognize that the Commission for the Control of Interpol's Files, the CCF, did get a budget increase and a personnel expansion last year, and I applaud that. The CCF ultimately cannot work, given the increasing volume of work it's facing, in my view, unless it becomes a full-time professional body. And that's not a criticism of the current CCF members, who I think are conscientious and have radically raised the standard of CCF decisions over the last few years. They are simply swamped by work. The CCF needs to be bigger, and it needs to meet continuously. Second, this Interpol needs to continue to clean up its budget. Interpol's funding, which I could go into in great detail, relies very significantly on project funding from individual member nations to fund projects that they find particularly appealing. The risk of that is that one nation, China, for example, can end up funding projects that are essentially Chinese, or they could be Iranian or Venezuelan or many other nations, or Turkey, one-off projects that they are particularly interested in. The risks of that strike me as fairly obvious. I would like to see a system where all Interpol projects are agreed by the executive committee, endorsed by the General Assembly, and equally funded by all Interpol member nations in proportion of their recognized budgetary contributions. So no single source funding. And third, I would like to see Interpol become a lot less cautious about naming and shaming the nations that break its rules. We know that these nations exist. It would be an insult at this point to go on about whether or not Interpol abuse exists. We all know that it exists. But what we don't know is how the system of so-called corrective measures within Interpol works, which nations are actually subject to it, what gradations there are, when the measures are applied, when they are removed. And, well, we do know one thing. We know Interpol doesn't want to suspend or expel any of its member nations, no matter how abusive they are. I think that's a grave mistake. I think Interpol needs to establish deterrent power by, at a minimum, publicly suspending a particularly abusive member. And I would like to see a nation expelled from Interpol to create deterrent power. But at a minimum, let us please have some clarity on what the system of corrective measures means, who is subject to it, and what are the trigger thresholds for being placed within corrective measures.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Ted. Michelle, can I just turn back to you in our closing few minutes and ask you this? You're an attorney. You have many clients who come to you who make the case to you and then to Interpol that they've been subjected to improperly issued red notices and diffusions. What would you like to see to the process and the system that it currently stands to kind of stop those red notices being issued in the first place? And where there are defective red notices issued, what would you change in the system to make it more effective and easier to challenge those notices?
So I suppose right now, I would have to talk about timing of decisions. And as Ted said, we do know that there's help that's on the way. I believe it's this fall that the new incoming class or group of employees who are gonna help move the workload along are gonna start. So unfortunately, we're back to the time of before there was a time limit. You know, years ago, I remember writing to Interpol asking, hey, what's the time limit? And being told, we can't possibly put a time limit on this kind of work. You know, that was before there was a time limit. Well, now we do have it. And for many years, they were in good compliance with that. And you could predict it. And now we absolutely can't. So as we stand today, we need a time limit back, because justice delayed is justice denied. And part of what they do is help with justice so that's my first thing. And I do know they're working towards that, which is a good thing. The second thing that is coming up again and again, and this is not something that would make it easier to avoid a red notice well, it could actually, you know, it is transparency in the restriction, what can be disclosed to the applicant. I have seen recently increased restriction in what's being provided for and what the CCF is allowed to disclose to the applicant, including complete refusal to disclose whether there is or is not any data. And I have not received that response very frequently. What we don't get with that is the reasoning. And the reason that I say transparency is important in saying why is the country allowed to not disclose information is because when we ask what Interpol has in a regular access request, it requires the CCF to pull it up, have a look at it, send it to us. And we frequently see that some very basic elements are not there, right? They have such a workload, they're not going to look at every single request as closely as they might like to, or as we might like them to. So when we have that quick look, it reveals that there are discrepancies. I suspect that when countries are asking for restriction or a complete full non-disclosure, and we have a look at that, it's disclosed to the applicant. Why is that? Is it really an ongoing investigation? Is there really a concern for the safety of a third party or the applicant? That there will be no reason. This is my suspicion. I've never seen it, but it's very difficult to have faith in that legitimacy of a non-disclosure if we don't know what the reason was, you know? So that's my second thing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
No, go ahead, please.
The third thing is, I'm with Ted on this 100%. NCB sanction transparency. How many times have clients told me, okay, I'm glad we won our case, but I don't want this to happen to another person. Can you contact Interpol and tell them what the NCB did and give them this information of, sometimes when we have evidence that an NCB official is attempting to bribe the client, the applicant, to get the notice removed, and we provide that to Interpol, the notice gets removed, but we never hear about any sanctions.
Yeah.
It takes away from the legitimacy and the reputation of Interpol and the faith. They may be doing it, but we never hear about it. So to me, that's very, very important. And that goes along with, you know, the idea that Ben brought up, which is, why is it that we want to, why does the presidency matter? Who is it? You know, it is because I understand that we've got countries who want to raise their level of credibility and kind of whitewash their reputation. But the other part of what happens when we allow, or they allow, a president to be elected from a country that really has a bad reputation for transparency and human rights and all of that, is that it doesn't just raise that country's reputation, it lowers Interpol's reputation. And you think back to what you were taught as a kid, if you're hanging around with 3 lazy guys, you're going to be the 4th. If you're hanging around with 3 stand-up guys, you're going to be the 4th. You are the company that you keep. So it's very important that Interpol holds itself separate and apart from a country that is steadily diminishing its own reputation by its own actions.
Absolutely. But it's interesting. You talk about a couple of things I want to pick up on. You talk about the time frames. What you're describing is exactly the same things that Ben and I have seen over the last few years. We have live cases where we've made applications to the CCF where we haven't heard anything back substantively for over 2 years. And it really, you know, it's a trite thing to say, but if I may, you're absolutely spot on with your quote, justice delayed is justice denied. And we're dealing with individuals who often find themselves in the most dire of circumstances. They're trapped in foreign jurisdictions, they've been debanked, they're constantly anxious about the consequences for travel and the other sanctions that might come their way. The final thing that I want to say is that we'll be watching very closely what happens over the next few days, weeks. Ted, I suspect that you're going to have a lot of insights that you can give to us when you're on the ground in Morocco.
Yeah, I mean, in spite of the lack of freedom to walk around and just talk with people, you do end up learning a surprising amount on the ground. I wish we could learn more.
Yeah, and those things that you do learn will appear in your blogs over the next few days and weeks. Well, look, we've come to the end of our time. Let me say thank you to our panel, Michelle, Ben, and Ted. Fascinating insights from 3 fantastic experts who really know the area so well. We'll continue to monitor the situation. We'll be blogging, we'll be writing, and of course, we are all of us here to hear from you if you've got any questions that you want to send to us via email or indeed any issues that you have with regard to red notices that may affect you, your clients or people that you know. So to those watching, thank you very much. To our panel, thank you very much and good evening.
Thank you. Good to see everybody.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.